Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side, and today I have a very interesting guest. Her name is Berit Bogaard, and she is a neuropsychology guru. And Dr. Bogaard is a professor of philosophy and directs her own laboratory where they study multisensory research at the University of Miami. And I believe you're also connected with another school, are you not?
Yeah, University of Oslo, and I have some connection to a network at University of Toronto.
Right. So a little bit of academic credentialing is always good, right?
Yeah. It's not bad. It's not bad.
Now, the book that we're talking about today is called The Superhuman Mind, Free the Genius in Your Brain, and you have a co-author on that, right?
That's correct. Christian Marlowe.
Yeah. And this is put out, by the way, folks, if you're looking for it, it's from Hudson Street Press, which is a division of Penguin.
Yes, that's right.
Pretty nice press. So let's talk about superhuman brains. Now, my wife has always told me I have a superhuman brain.
I'm sure you do.
But I don't think she meant it quite the way you meant it. Okay. What do you mean by a superhuman brain?
Well, I actually mean a brain that uses more of its potential. So I mean a quite ordinary brain, but a brain that has that you have sort of made into a brain that can use more of its potential, because the premise in the book is that every person has a great potential inside them, and that can be unleashed if you work a little bit on it. And so we back that up with various studies and case studies and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that you are very aware of is synesthesia. I know you've done a lot of great work in the field of synesthesia, which maybe first we better define what that is before we talk about it.
Yes, synesthesia is an abnormal wiring of the brain so that you have two senses or two sensory streams that connect when they don't normally do. So, for example, you might hear colors when hearing, or see colors when you hear music, or you might see letters printed in black as, for example, particular colors like red or green or blue. Mm-hmm. Or you might feel pain. If you have a toothache, you might feel the pain as a color. So some people have the color orange associated with pain, so they can tell which tooth has the problem because the tooth would be yellow. Mm-hmm. So that would be one example of it. It goes a little broader than that. So there are ways that we can connect things more conceptually, and that's something that's used a lot by authors in literature, for example. So there's synesthesia in that sense, where you associate one concept with another concept where they're not normally associated. So, for instance, you might think of a certain sound as having a certain color, and if that color is really descriptive of the sound, then that can be very effective for
such as
others.
Yeah, if you were writing a poem about, for example, a war and something of war, and you had a band, or let's say a bagpipes marching in front of the British troops, which they often do, and you might talk about the red skirl of the bagpipes.
That's exactly right. So that's synesthesia sort of used to emphasize something to readers who can connect with that, because we all have a form of synesthesia in us, and so we connect very well with those kinds of associations, even if we don't have the genuine kind.
Yeah, but actually experiencing, of course, that's a very unique thing. And one of those things that you find sometimes in people who are, let's say, differently abled, for example, the autistic, sometimes have these unique capacities that the rest of us, because their brains aren't wired quite the same way as ours.
That's quite right. So people with autism sometimes have brains that are wired more locally. That means that they get tighter wiring in more localized areas instead of long-range sort of brain connections. So you can think about it as if you had a a whole country with little cities in them. So if you had a network that needed to stretch from New York to Miami, then you might have to sort of scale down on the connections within Miami or within New York. But people with autism have, instead of having these long-term connections or long-range connections in them, they have an enormously tight, connected brain in certain areas that gives them that potential.
Yeah, yes. So those little areas are functioning incredibly well, but all the other connections that we might expect to be having, like with the rest of the environment, the rest of our sensory environment, are kind of being pushed to the side.
That's right. Yeah.
And, of course, idiot savants are a very special kind of group of people.
Yeah.
And you've studied a few of them.
Yeah, so some of people, I mean, about 10% of people with autism have savant syndrome, but we have studied people who have acquired savant syndrome after a brain injury or brain disease. Mm-hmm. So they have been completely ordinary folks working ordinary jobs. Then they have hurt their head in some way, or they have had a brain disease. And then suddenly they discover that they have this talent that they didn't notice before. And it sort of comes out of the blue almost in some cases. So that's how they describe it, that suddenly they have this new interest and apparently also the abilities.
Yeah, and some of these abilities, even that appear, seem to be, I don't know, not even learned. You know, they're suddenly able to speak a language.
Yeah, there have been examples of that. So where people have been exposed to languages. In the most extreme case of a subject, she was exposed to some Eastern European languages when she was very little. Mm-hmm. But as you know, what happens if you don't use the language, it's sort of gone, or at least it seems to be gone. And she fell down a mountain in Colorado, being a farmer. And when she woke up, she also had other abilities. But one thing, she actually was able to recall some of that language. So she wasn't able to speak it fluently, but she was able to recall some phrases of that language after having not been able to recall any of the language for all that time. And then, of course, there have been recent cases in the media where someone who didn't have much exposure to Spanish, or at least didn't speak it, woke up and couldn't speak English but could only speak Spanish. So, yes, so there are cases like that too.
Now, that suggests something very fascinating about brains, that we have this enormous amount of storage capacity and capacity to do things, but that for some reason we don't have access to.
Yes, so in many cases we don't have access to areas of our brain. And by access here, of course, we primarily mean conscious access, because that's when you can actually use it. For instance, when you are asked to do something, right, you can provide the answer. So even if your brain has the ability to calculate some big numbers, but you can't access it, then it's no use, right? I mean, in terms of your if you're asked to do it, you can't really do it because you can't access it. So it's sort of conscious access that we're talking about.
Yeah. So it's this process by which things are kind of put into some kind of hidden memory box where we don't have access, and then something will happen that give us the key, and now we can open that. And so one of the goals of your book, The Superhuman Mind, is to help people figure out ways, without hitting themselves on the head, mind you. We're not recommending climbing a mountain and jumping off and head first, but these are ways to find these keys and develop these keys.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there are areas that we can't access, but that are actually in use for calculating all kinds of things. So you could take an example of where you have to grab your coffee cup, right, or your bottle of water. You have to calculate very precisely how much to bend your fingers, how much it weighs, and which obstacle to go around, and so on. But those calculations are not sort of consciously accessible. We couldn't just like sit down and put them on a physics test, right? So in some cases we really do have to, right, without any effort, right? But the trick is to also be able to access some of those abilities and some of that hidden memory without, sort of willfully and consciously.
And of course, that example of picking up a coffee cup gets us into a wonderful area that's not kind of removed from you, but but in a way related to artificial intelligence. Because, of
Yes.
course, there are people now trying to create robotics in which a machine can figure out, okay, how can I walk and chew gum at the same time kind of
That's
problems.
right, yes.
And it's amazing if you think about it, and if you look at how difficult it is to create these machines, especially when you get beyond the simple logical calculation. When they got computers that could play chess, people
Yes.
said, "Oh, they've reached the pinnacle." But
Right.
it really isn't the pinnacle. It's much more difficult to reach over and pick up your coffee cup and tilt it without spilling the coffee on your head or
Exactly.
something. I'm not going to
That's
demonstrate
exactly right.
that.
That's much more difficult. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and the difference there between, say, an expert chess player and when you pick up your coffee cup is that the expert chess player has more access, right, to those areas that do these amazing calculations. You do the amazing calculations when you lift your coffee cup and reach for it and bypass obstacles. But you wouldn't be able to reproduce which calculations exactly they are.
Yeah. And now, so what are some of would you like to, before we end this segment, would you like to suggest one thing that our listeners could try at home to help them develop a more superhuman mind?
Well, so that's a simple thing that that some people know about, but a lot of people don't use it very effectively, and that is to use more sensory inputs when you try to remember something. Because most things that people try to remember, they can at least in most cases be very abstract, such as phone numbers or names.
Right.
Or even a shopping list, abstract items on a shopping list. And so you can use more of your bodily emotions and your senses in order to remember something. So a very simple example that was given to me by a memory champion in Denmark, my native country, is so let's say that you are trying to remember a shopping list of 3 items. One is milk, one is red wine, and the third one is a bunch of oranges. So you could put them in your house. So you put the milk, but not just the milk in the kitchen. You put the milk in a waterfall in the kitchen to provoke sort of an absurd feeling. Plus, it now has a location. Then you walk into the living room, and there you see a scattered bottle with all the red wine that looks like blood. So you get a sense of fear, perhaps. So you evoke the feeling of fear, and again you have the location and you have a path, and you walk out on the terrace, and there you might see the small oranges have small smiley faces and talking to each other. So it's funny. So then you provoke another emotion, and again you have a path and a location. So that's an example of how you can remember something by using more of your senses.
Of course, if you're me, having those 3 examples, you'd mix them up totally. You'd think of a leak in the kitchen and the work of trying to fix it, trying to get under the sink to fix the leak of the leaking milk, whacking yourself on the head with the wrench, bleeding out, and then somebody coming with bandages, and the bandages are an orange, because you see, that's my quirky. So the
right, so that's very highly individualized, and that's a very good one. So it just sort of depends on what you associate with, but that's exactly like the method.
We'll be right back.
We now bring you the amazing story of a man whose severe concussion suddenly made him a mathematical savant. It's a medical mystery that scientists are still trying to unravel. And he's not alone. From a stroke survivor who became a brilliant sculptor to a young epileptic who mastered an entire language in 7 days. Cases like this spark a thrilling question. Could this genius potential exist within us all? Here's ABC's Neil Karlinsky with an encore presentation.
Behind the counter at a futon store in Tacoma, Washington is not the place you expect to find a man some call a genius, a math phenom of unprecedented proportions. Yet Jason Paget sees complex mathematical formulas everywhere he looks. When you're walking through a park like this, I'm looking and I'm seeing trees and leaves and clouds. What do you see?
I see bits and pieces of the Pythagorean theorem everywhere. Every single little curve, every single spiral, every tree is part of that equation.
Amazingly, Jason doesn't have a PhD, a college degree, or even a background in math. 10 years ago, he was only interested in two things: working out and partying. He was walking out of this place, what used to be a karaoke club, when he was brutally attacked by thieves who beat and kicked him in the head repeatedly.
All I saw was a bright flash of light, and the next thing I knew, I was on my knees on the ground, and I thought, I'm gonna get killed.
Doctors said he had a concussion, but within a
Okay, welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. And I'm having a wonderful conversation with Berit Bogaard. Now, we've been talking about her book on the brain, but and special abilities, and I think one of the most special abilities that a person has is our ability to love. And Berit, you wrote a book on romantic love. It's called On Romantic Love, Simple Truths About a Complex Emotion, and it's from Oxford Press?
Oxford University Press.
Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. So, talk to me about love. And while you're talking about love, I'll think about my wife.
Yes, so I wrote this book on the basis of, or partially on the basis of a blog that I run on Psychology Today that's called The Mysteries of Love. And some of the things that I thought would be important to look at would be things like, can it sometimes be unreasonable or irrational to love someone? And so there's been a lot of disagreement about that, especially in philosophy, about whether you can have that kind of irrational love, or whether love is simply a passion that is completely not under your control in any way. Because you would think that if it could be irrational, then there could also be steps you could take to fall out of love. So I wrote about that, and also looked at other things like how romantic love is different from attachment. So attachment you can have with a dog, right? Maybe you can also love a dog, but not romantically, hopefully. Yeah.
Although your dog might love you romantically, but that's a whole other experience.
But the attachment love is different. So I wanted to draw a distinction between those, and also talk about love, how love can come in degrees, and that sometimes we have trouble sort of connecting even when we are in a loving relationship, because there are degrees of love, and we might be in love to a different degree, but not necessarily always in the same order, right? So we might sort of fluctuate and be into each other to a different extent at different times. Mm-hmm. And that's completely natural, even though sometimes it doesn't sound so natural, right? If you ask your wife, are you in love with me, or do you love me? And she said, well, I sort of kind of did a little bit yesterday, but not so much today. That wouldn't be so good, right? So we don't really like those answers, but I wanted to sort of spell out that that's sort of a perfectly natural aspect of the emotion love.
Well, if you think about what we were talking about earlier, about the diffuseness versus the focusedness of the brain, it makes perfectly good sense. Now, when my wife, who happens to be a painter, and she has many other wonderful artistic skills, but I think in terms of fame to others, I think she's best known as a painter. And when she's in the process of painting, she is, I am aware that she is much less aware of me, I think. And in fact, she actually came up with a wonderful concept years ago called stimulus primacy. And that at any given moment, certain stimuli have greater primacy for us because we're already focusing our attention. And the question is, one of the ways she talked about love, she's a very bright woman, one of the ways she talked about love was the relative stimulus primacy of the person in different kinds of situations. So, for example, if I am in the middle of weeding the garden, which anybody who knows me knows I never did. But if I were, and she called out, would I be more aware of her then than if I were in the middle, say, of writing a novel?
Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, and then how do you grade that? So
that is exactly right. Yeah.
So somebody who's actually in love, totally in a sense, is almost functioning like an autistic person because they're not able to access the broader.
Yeah, that's right. So that's interesting. That's another aspect of love that you can actually, exactly. You can lose attention focus. You can lose your ability to want to be with other people. So that there you have another aspect of it. You can also sort of sometimes if it's love gone bad, right? You can almost feel as if you have an anxiety disorder or a form of depression. Mm-hmm. So there are many ways in which love, and romantic love in particular, can resemble sort of mental, different kinds of mental functioning that have nothing to do with love.
And then, of course, there's the synesthetic value of love. Of all the things that I think of when talking about synesthesia, not as an aberrant, unusual event, but a common event, synesthesia and sound of words.
Yes.
Love so completely connects us to poetry. So much poetry. And poetry.
Yes. Yes, so we see that throughout history, of course, and also poetry in the form of lyrics, right, for songs. Mm-hmm. So that's a classical theme. So there's definitely something about emotions and being a little bit shaken up, right, not being in your total normal, comfortable state and being creative. Mm-hmm. So that's that's an interesting connection.
Yeah. So. Love is, I guess for you and me, because we're out of a neurology, psychology background, to us, love is almost like a mediating concept or a hypothetical construct that we use in understanding, okay, we're putting something into the brain and looking at what comes out. Now, if we can raise the love level, I will let bend things.
I mean, it relates very much to what we talked about in the first segment, because when people have brain injuries and they become obsessed with a new thing, like they become obsessed with mathematics or they become obsessed with painting, with drawing. Of course, that's a different kind of love because it's love of doing something. But it's still a kind of passion, so it's related to the kind of love and passion that you can feel for people.
Yeah, it changes what stimulus primacies are, and it changes how things are processed.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, yeah.
So love, we can think of love that way, we can think of rage that way, we can think of happiness that way, we can think of anxiety that way as this kind of mediating process that changes the brain function.
Yeah, and happiness is a good example because when people lose their happiness and they go towards either full-blown depression or they go some of the way towards becoming depressed, many people have also lost their love for about everything, right? That's sort of the inability, the anhedonia, the inability to feel passionate about anything. So happiness is closely tied up with being able to feel a kind of passion and love for others or for certain subject matters.
So the capacity, it sounds in a way like the ideal would be to be happy. Don't worry, be happy. Right. That's not, though. It's actually the ability to fluidly move among these intense emotions.
Yeah.
And harness them and combine them so that we can really optimize functioning, which gets us back to artificial intelligence. Do you think that there's anybody thinking about, in a robot robotic design, do you think there's anybody who's thinking, oh, gee, if we don't get the passion in there, if we don't allow the robot to decide which mix of passions, in a sense, we're never going to really get a functioning being.
I think that in some sense, yes, if we can simulate some of the passions, and if we talk about passions in the old philosophical sense, that also involves the negative emotions, right? So if we are not able to simulate the emotions, and particularly the feeling, right, that those emotions provoke, then I think that robots are going to be very, very different from the way that we are. They're not going to be able to invent new things, not as easily anyway. They might be able to do it on an intellectual level, but they're not going to be able to, the creativity will be limited, for example, I think. And they're not going to be original to the same extent.
Yeah, certainly the originality relies on passion.
Yeah.
I agree. So, hey, if you're designing your robot, folks, just think about how you're going to put the emotions in there. Now, of course, in the evolution of humans, or if you prefer, the God's design of humans, I prefer going with the evolution myself.
Yeah.
That we have these very intense passion, if you will, systems in our brain, mostly in the limbic part of the brain, in the middle. And that gets really turned on, particularly during adolescence. Especially with the development when we start producing these hormones that we have only produced in small amounts, in much bigger amounts, and it affects the expression of that part of the brain. And then, of course, we develop the ability to focus that down and choose more among and control that emotion.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly what goes on in adolescence, and it's also when the brain becomes more effective. And there's still pruning going on, right? There's still a lot of formation of new connections in the brain and removal of connections that are not used, and so on. So
an elaboration of the connection between that middle part of your brain, that limbic part of your brain, and the frontal lobes.
Yes, that's when that develops. I mean, begins to develop.
So that this, one of the things is that I guess I want to say here is the passion you feel when you're young is different from what I mean when now that I'm in my dotage, what I mean by love is very different from what I meant by love when I was a teenager, because when I was a teenager, there was no cognitive function dampening it down. I was much more of an idiot savant of love.
Right. That's exactly right. No, when you put the cognitive element back into the picture, it's going to feel differently because you're able to reflect on it much more effectively.
So, folks, while you're reflecting on your love, I'm going to take a quick break and then we'll be back.
You're about to meet a woman who is truly one of a kind. That's because a near-deadly accident turned her otherwise ordinary mind into an extraordinary one. ABC's Neil Karlinsky finds out what it's like to have all your senses scrambled in a newly superhuman brain.
Probabilities and what are disabilities?
Lee Ersig is unlike anyone you will probably ever meet, so buckle up for a ride like none other into the mind of an accidental genius.
Yeah, but too, you have a linear line with what is. In some theories.
She's also an artist.
What is the deepest obscure of accounts?
And a poet.
Within my memories, I walk to the fourth of my mind. Still I see nothing.
And the way she sees the world is unlike anything you can imagine. And it all happened because of an accident, making her the only known woman in the world with something called acquired savant syndrome, described as vastly enhanced cognitive ability in areas such as art and math. And acquired savant syndrome is when you're not born with it, like Lee.
We're at Split Rock Ranch.
It was on this ranch in northwestern Colorado, a place she no longer remembers, where her life changed forever. In 2009, Lee, the ranch manager, who could care less about mathematical formulas, was feeding chickens.
So where was it again?
Down there.
She fell into the ravine, suffering catastrophic spine and brain injuries.
So I don't know what type of fall it was, but it must have been pretty dramatic.
Do you remember being here at all?
No, not really. I just, I remember them saying, Lee, keep breathing.
You do remember that?
I remember it was a sheriff, and he said, Lee, keep breathing.
Doctors were initially unsure she'd ever walk again. But after treating her initial brain trauma, she seemed to be making a full recovery, and no one noticed that it was actually her brain that suffered the most severe damage, but in a very unique way. Lee had no memory of her old life when she was a multi-sport athlete who loved animals, not math or art. Her childhood, gone. Her mother, a total stranger. Lee relies on her best friend since 5th grade, Amber Anastasio.
This was Rue. You guys were really close.
To help her understand who she used to be.
And who's Jackie?
Jackie is my mother.
Were you guys close?
I don't know.
She was initially misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, in part because she lost the ability to feel emotion, what doctors describe as flat affect.
Lee was a total extrovert. She just very confident. I just know that she's different now. It's not a bad different, it's just who she is now.
Fly within.
In addition to her savant syndrome, she also acquired synesthesia. That's a mixing of senses. Listen to Lee try to explain it on a road trip across Colorado.
If I turn on your music, you're seeing colors.
Right.
If I ask you to look at nature, you said you're hearing or seeing sound. So you hear images and you see sound.
Right.
Boy, that's hard to fathom. I'm gonna turn it up, and then I want to know what colors you hear. Ready? Here we go.
Black, blue, orange, and then a yellow.
Black, blue, orange, and yellow.
Yeah.
Now she has a home filled with mathematical equations and art, her interpretations of how she sees the world.
What's running through your mind when you're
All
doing
dimensions of the house.
this? The dimensions of this house?
Yes. This is what it represents. Occupancy of a triangle, of a linear line, of circulations.
Help me understand that.
Okay.
I know you see things differently than we do.
Yes.
So, I see just sort of a plain room with a couple of windows. There's some stairs.
Those are the stairs. Stairs are concepts, theories, divine.
The birth of strange new talents has left Lee lonely at times and desperate to understand what's happened to her, and if what she is seeing in her mind is real. So along with her childhood friend Amber, she made the journey to the University of Miami, where neuroscientist Berit Bogaard and her team scanned and rigorously tested her brain.
She wants some objective evidence that what she's experiencing is real.
And after the first test, it started to become clear how differently she sees the world. Details are everything. Check this out. Can you see a difference between these two images?
Yeah.
Lee can do it in a snap. We started to understand why she draws things the way she does. If you ask most people to draw a house or a car, they'll start with the outline and then fill in the details, like the windows, doors, and wheels. But Lee, she starts with those details, the windows, the doors, the wheels, and then builds out.
So that's an example of how she's attending to details before she's attending to the whole.
And remember how Lee says she hears colors and sees sounds? The doctor says that's real too.
About half of the letters of the alphabet and half of the numbers, she has specific colors associated with them.
It's kind of a heavy question, but do you think the person you were is the person you were supposed to be, or is the person you are now really who you are?
I don't know. I can't remember, or I don't remember the last person.
But Lee has embraced her new identity and her new view of the world as colors and numbers. A beautiful mind she is just beginning to understand. I'm Neil Karlinski for Nightline in Maybell, Colorado.
Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. And we've been talking with Dr. Berit Bogaard and having a wonderful time for me. I hope for you too, folks. And certainly for you. Now, before I go on to my next topic, I wanted to go back to, you mentioned you have a blog for Psychology Today.
Yes.
Now, folks, that's a great website. Of course, it's a magazine, but it's a great website. And Berit has 2 blogs there. So if you go to Psychology Today's website, you can look for The Mysteries of Love, I shouldn't say or, and The Superhuman Mind. And those are the 2 blogs that Berit runs for them and posts on for them. And I think you'll probably find it pretty interesting. I know I find a lot of her ideas fascinating. So besides going to, of course, Amazon or going over to your Barnes or other bookstore and asking for The Superhuman Mind and on Romantic Love, you can go on to Psychology Today. So, and is there another website you'd like? Any other website you want to mention?
For people who are more interested in research, so are more science-oriented, there is the Bogaard Lab, as in laboratory, bogaardlab.com, which describes some of our research that we do I also run a lab where we have looked at some of the people with brain injury and so on. And so there's a little more of a science-based approach on those sites. Or on that site, the lab page. So that's another possibility.
By the way, folks, in case you don't know, and I don't know why you would, if you're typically listening to this, you probably are hearing Bogaard is spelled Brogaard, but it's not. It's Brogaard, 2 A's, and
That's right.
Berit is spelled Berit.
Yeah.
Want to make sure you all know that. So now, one of the things that I know you have worked on is meaning of words.
Yeah.
And of course, as an author, that fascinates me. And you actually have done some writing and research on a topic that we writers dispute a lot.
Right.
Okay. Now, I'll write something like this. John looked angrily at his partner.
Yes.
And my writing peers will say, wait a minute, that's a point of view issue. Who is seeing John? To whom does John look this way?
Mm-hmm.
And I have always said, well, no, I think that's more of a universal quality. If I say somebody looks angrily, we all have a notion of that, and it's meaningful. And I think that's something you have something to say about. You have some research.
Yeah, I like to think of some meanings, at least, as public objects. And by public object, I mean something that you can perceive through your senses. With words, you will use partially your hearing, of course. Mm-hmm. So if you have a chair in the room, all right, we get different perceptions when we're looking at it, because you might be standing behind it, I might be standing in front of it, someone might be looking at it from above, but we're looking at the same chair, and we can understand that it's the same chair. So it's not as if I say, oh, but it looks this way because I'm looking at it from above. Right. But you start disagreeing with me because we have a sense that there is a different perspective that we can take with respect to the chair. And so I want to say that at least some meanings, and a lot of times, I mean, most of the meanings that we convey to other people are public objects in the same way. So there might be different perspectives, different ways that we can sort of perceive these meanings, but they are public in the sense that they can be perceived because they're not private. How would we ever understand each other if we had these sounds and meanings and looks that were all just private or only in our minds? Mm-hmm. So that's something I've been trying to defend in several papers.
So when we use a term like looked or sounded or something like that, it isn't so much the point of view issue, is that we're telling people which perspective to take.
Yeah.
Whereas
That's right.
if I use, if I show it instead of telling it, which is what people are always saying, show it, don't tell.
Yeah.
So I put it into words, but that doesn't convey that my emphasis is now on the sound of his voice.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's much more room for interpretation if you start describing John's face, right? So instead of describing how he sounded, or how he looked, if you go into more details about what goes into how do we show that he is angry. Well, sometimes you need to focus on the looks, right, or the sounds right, in order to do that. So I wouldn't say it's just telling, right? It's still not telling. It's still a way of showing. If you,
it is showing because you're emphasizing the perceptual pathway. Yes. What stimuli are you giving primacy to go back to that?
Right.
Yeah. So, what is your current project? Besides you doing your 2 blogs on the superhuman mind and Mysteries of Love for Psychology Today, what other projects are you working on at this point?
So I'm working on a book on hate or hatred, but not just hatred in the group sense that has been so much in the media more recently, but also personal hate. So how that differs from other negative emotions, for example, and how it differs from anger. And of course, there's also the old saying that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. So it has a connection to love in that sense. So that's one of the projects I'm working on, in addition to the perception of meanings that I'm also going to develop into a bigger project.
Now, that's a lot. When you study something like what we mean by love, what we mean by hate, are you doing this through self-report? Are you doing it through using PET scans, EEGs? What are some of the tools that you use in the lab there, in the Bogaard lab?
I use a variety of different tools. So because I have a background in neuroscience as well, I do look at the brain sometimes and talk about neurotransmitters and what goes into that when people have different emotions. I also sometimes do behavioral studies with people where you might be exposed to certain kinds of stimuli, certain kinds of images, and to see how people react to those. And then, of course, I do the more sort of foundational conceptual work, which is the more philosophical work, where you sort of try to find out sort of what do we actually mean when we say that we, for example, hate someone, right? What do we mean in those cases? And that's something where, we could ask a lot of people and take an average of all those people, but we can also sort of think about the concept and see if we can come up with a good analysis of what the concept means. So I use philosophical tools, psychological tools, and neuroscience tools to investigate these topics.
Yeah, that's one of the things I kind of have been impressed by as I've looked at your work, which is that you're not a reductionist, nor are you a broad, frilly thinker, but rather you are building an entire structure. And I like that, especially in psychological areas, psychology and psychological sciences. I like the idea that it's like building a house. The components have to go together. You can't just build the roof, and you can't just build the foundation or the walls. You have to put them all together, or you don't have a house.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's a very good metaphor for that. What I'm trying to do, sort of attacking a problem from different angles. That's what I like to do. So you give different perspectives on it, and then you can sort of make up your mind about your own point of view after looking at it from these different perspectives.
So before we start, I'm going to ask you for one more suggestion for our wonderful audience, one more thing they could try doing to help them understand their own functioning, improve their functioning, build their own superhuman capacities.
Yes, so in addition, we talked about memory earlier. There's also synesthesia we have used successfully in a sense that we have tried to teach people synesthesia. So people who don't actually, say, hear tones as colored or see letters or words as colored. We've tried to teach people synesthesia, and it turns out that in many cases it can help improve people's creativity and originality and even memory or other abilities. So that's is something to you might have to start out at a very sort of conceptual level by getting used to associating things that you're not associating. But the sort of aim of that whole thing is that you start to, for instance, see musical notes as colored, right? So you can sort of maybe do it a little bit willfully at first, but then eventually it should become sort of second nature, and that's a way that people can sort of develop synesthesia, which has all these useful purposes. So that's also something we talk a lot about in the book, and some people use it with children to develop perfect pitch with respect to music.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, yeah. They get the kids to see a color with the sound, so they can then have a double way of checking the sound.
Yeah.
You know. And then you can do that in a learned way. For example, you can create a computer program, and people have, where if you play a note, you get a color, and you can do something like that with children. For my part, this is very funny. I do that quite naturally, especially at symphony.
Yeah.
And I go to symphony, and I close my eyes. And I love classical music. I close my eyes and I see color patterns. That's what I see.
Yes. Wow, yeah.
And when I go to museums, by the way, I love to go to see the color field paintings.
Yes.
So it's not too far a stretch for me to do that.
Right.
And so I sit there, and the worst thing is, okay, I have to say this, inevitably, if you go to live symphony, somebody is going to cough or drop something or do some horrible behavior like that.
That's right.
It is really amazing what happens to my color fields when I'm sitting there and I'm listening to, say, Brahms, and I've got all these wonderful pastoral kind of colors going across, and all of a sudden somebody coughs. Oh, come on, I know they're not doing attention. I know they're not evil. But all of a sudden, through my beautiful color field painting comes a jagged light.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's very illuminating.
So, folks, there's another thing you could try to create your own superhuman brain. And then I'm going to tell you one more thing you can do to develop your superhuman brain, which is buy yourself a copy of the book by Berit Bogaard and her co-author. And while you're at it, learn about your love life a little and buy on romantic love. And Berit, thanks so very much for joining me walking on the lean side.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been very interesting.